It's been 6 entire years, but MAPPA's most underrated anime is finally back and better than ever, emerging from the mud sludge that is the studio's project scheduling, just like I, Coleman, emerging from the mud sludge that is a literal river of mud sludge. Why do I keep saying mud sludge so much? Because that's the closest thing we have to a direct translation of the semi-nonsensical title, of course, Dorohedoro. Season 1, based on Q Hayashida's grimy, convoluted, joyously grotesque masterpiece of a manga, was released in 2020 and got right up to the point where the story is about to really take off, and then disappeared without a trace, only to resurface one quinquennium and a year later as if nothing had happened. No recap or anything, just straight back in. If you didn't watch the first season, don't worry, we don't have any clue what's going on either. That's the true Dorohedoro experience. I was convinced to make this video mostly by episode 6, which is a microcosm for the season and shows just how far we've come. I mean, just look at this avant-garde dream sequence from the end of the episode and tell me that this isn't the most beautifully unsettling thing you've seen this decade and exactly what Uzumaki was trying to be. This headless bozo walking from one freaky painted masterpiece to the next. Amalgamations of human construction and spaghetti flesh mushroom nonsense past a handful of what look like coffins, one's already been destroyed, and that background art gradually morphs into a throat, a tongue, teeth. It almost makes you forget to ask what the meaning of all that symbolism actually is. Then a man bursts from one of the coffins drenched in tar, an image that looks like it could be straight out of Akira. This is a profoundly silly show, but when it takes a turn into straight up art house horror, top-notch execution is vitally important. I love this manga series, and season 1 was a pretty good adaptation, but it wasn't the most popular for two main reasons: the unconventional and deeply unhinged story that doesn't appeal to the widest audience, and the fact that it's mostly 3D animated, which many people find off-putting. I made a video about it a while back, and I'll put it in the top corner of the screen in case you want to watch it later or before this one, but in part of that one I argued that the 3D was actually surprisingly fitting for Dorohedoro, and I'm here to report that the second season is a big step up. Not just because this is the point in the series where a confusing web of disparate characters and plot elements finally start to converge into an, I'll be honest, still incredibly confusing but more cohesive whole, that's whole spelled with a W, but also in its visual style. It's a case study in clever direction decisions and playing to the strengths of the source material and the medium. So why is that? Let's have a find out, shall we? Pull up a chair. Whether you're familiar with the series or not, all are welcome. But first, you're also welcome to check out this video's sponsor, Pop Epoch. It's a casual idle management sim that respects your time. You start in the Ice Age and advance your tribe through history, watching your civilization visually evolve as you build monuments and discover new tech. Along the way, you can recruit legendary historical figures like Socrates and Joan of Arc to boost your progress with absolutely zero stressful micromanagement or complex strategy required. So if that sounds like your thing, use my link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen to download Pop Epoch and use the code POPLAUNCH for some free resource boxes when you start. Alright, back to it. Dorohedoro is a tale of two dimensions: the whole, a dark slum where humans get by as best they can, and the sorcerer's dimension, inhabited by a similar but biologically separate species of magic users whose social status is determined by the amount of magic smoke they can produce and how useful their particular type of magic is. Violent, gyoza-loving amnesiac Kaimon, who's mysteriously immune to magic, is on a quest with his best friend Nikaido to figure out who transformed his head into that of a lizard, who he is, and while he's at it, get revenge on any and all sorcerers who have been practicing their magic on helpless humans and choking the whole with pollution for generations. Meanwhile, Mob Boss N and his crime family of powerful magic users who rule over the plebeians of the Sorcerer's Dimension from his lavish mansion are also trying to figure out Kaimon's identity, while also crushing resistance from an equally brutal gang of unlucky sorcerers with little to no magic ability who had banded together to resist the tyrannical caste system of their world under the symbol of these cross markings over their eyes. Hayashida's manga is brutally violent and filled with, at times, horrific body horror, but it's also paradoxically lighthearted, charming, and downright cheerful. And it's all held together by her artwork, which is rough and scratchy, filled with a mind-boggling amount of detail, a style that should be nearly impossible to adapt into animation. But series director Yuichiro Hayashi and the whole crew at MAPPA have done 3 clever little tricks that make that impossible task possible by playing to the strengths of the source material and the medium. I'll admit it, I was one of those 2D animation purists who, growing up in the wake of the absolute decimation of hand-drawn animation here in the US, and every example of CGI in anime seeming to be just a cost-cutting measure, like filling backgrounds with distracting robotic CG characters with basic cell shading filters, had zero interest when it started getting incorporated more and more into my beautiful animu. To be fair, most of those early attempts looked like actual dog trash. I can't get over the fact that in Berserk 2016, they put this weird hatching filter over everything as if to be like, don't worry, it's still hand-drawn, even though virtually no hand-drawn animation actually looks like that. But I was wrong, and in recent years I've been impressed with 3D animation in anime, and we've come a long way on integrating it with 2D in a way that feels intentional. Chainsaw Man was a great example where the 2 styles were blended so seamlessly that you often couldn't even tell the difference. That's actually what started this channel. And even the several final seasons of Attack on Titan, despite their core thematic flaws, did a pretty good job of using 3D mostly for the Titans, which made it feel like they were on a different plane of existence. But the show that first started to open my eyes to the possibilities was Dorohedoro, from the same director as those several final seasons of Attack on Titan. On the surface, it seems completely insane to use CGI for a manga with such a raw, hand-drawn style like this, and I still see people wondering why in the world they would decide to do it this way, or assuming it's simply to save money. And sure, MAPPA does love to spread itself way too thin, so maybe that is part of it, but when you think about it, it actually paradoxically makes a lot of sense, and that rough, scratchy, hand-drawn style is actually the element that makes 3D so appropriate for this project. It would be practically impossible to come anywhere close to Hayashida's level of detail and dense hatching and wrinkles and several hand-drawn frames of animation for every second of video. I would have loved to see that version of Dorohedoro, don't get me wrong, but it would have taken decades or a veritable legion of animators to pull it off. But with a 3D model, along with some very clever compositing tricks that I won't pretend to know the intricacies of, you can draw all those little marks and details directly onto the surface, micro wrinkles and tears in fabric, little marks and imperfections in skin or metal, and the miscellaneous hatching that makes it feel like the entire world is coated in a layer of grime. And when you animate the model, there's no need to redraw every single one of those little marks for each new frame. Paimon spends about an episode wrapped in this apparatus of bandages layered over the usual lizard scales, with some extra little hooks dangling around for no reason. And I guarantee that in any but the most over-the-top TV productions, this would have either been greatly simplified or rendered as a still frame 90% of the time in 2D. Because it's a 3D model, there are no such restrictions. A while back, some friends and I watched through the original Trigun anime, highly recommended by the way, and a little while later gave a shot to Trigun Stampede. And while it's not a bad show by any means, and the visual direction and CGI utilization there is objectively top-notch, I couldn't help but feel like there was something missing. That something was the grime. In the original, everything feels dusty and crusty and rusty. It really feels like an old western set in a world that's been left behind, whereas the slick cleanliness of the remake loses so much of that identity. I think that's part of why making this show mostly in 3D seems so counterintuitive, because that clean aesthetic is so closely linked with 3D animation. But the Dorohedoro crew have shown that it doesn't have to be that way. But some of the biggest impact and the biggest improvements season to season are actually in the parts that aren't 3D. Dorohedoro is still a hybrid of multiple animation styles, and there are certain types of shots that 3D just isn't the best choice for. But while the worst examples of 3D anime, like X-Arm, will pick a medium seemingly at random or based solely on what's the cheapest and easiest for any particular element, so you end up with 2 characters standing right next to each other that look like they're from different dimensions, it turns out it is possible to make intentional decisions based on what will actually make a good final product. Because the CGI frees frees up so much time for the traditional animators, they can come in and fill in important moments with hand-drawn cuts that match the level of extreme detail. Most often, these are close-up shots inserted between the wider 3D shots. A pattern starts to appear in most action scenes in this show. They'll use 3D for the majority of the coverage, but then punch in for a hand-drawn extreme close-up on a character's face or a moment of impact or some important detail. And cuts like this one of Aikawa at a turning point in the series are able to maintain a level of detail approaching that of the manga even in motion, with each little wrinkle and hatching mark redrawn across 16 individual frames of bullet time movement, a time investment that otherwise might not have been possible. They'll also swap to 2D for something like this gruesome transformation, or even an entire flashback sequence like the origin of the Cross Eyes gang, which brings to light another aspect of the 3D, the goofy, kind of awkward feeling movement, which in many contexts could have been a weakness, here works in the show's favor because it fits the atmosphere and personality of many of the main characters, Kaimon in particular. It's a world, or rather a pair of worlds, filled with himbos and bimbos who are generally well-meaning, but often misguided. And when I'm reading the manga, yeah, I imagine bulky characters like Kaimon and Noe moving basically like this. It's what makes something that, on paper, feels like it should be an extremely depressing story somehow feel cheerful and endearing. So, switching to 2D can bring some extra dramatic weight to a tragic backstory, or one of a handful of moments where the series goes full-on horror mode. And the techniques that make the 2D and 3D animation look more similar have also come a long way since 2020. Take this simple head turn as an example. It's not just that the frames are limited to 3s, it's the spacing of the frames. The second frame is barely different from the first one as he eases out of the starting pose. There's more motion in the second, but the vast majority of the movement happens between frames 2 and 3 before easing into the second key pose with another frame that's hardly a centimeter apart from the final one. This is exactly the kind of timing you would get from having a traditional key animator draw out a timing chart on their rough Genga. And I'm not sure what kind of filters or technology they're using to make all these little lines and marks change a little bit from frame to frame, but it actually goes a long way to prevent the characters from feeling too robotic. The Dorohedoro manga would be nothing without its maximalist background art. It's dense and at times messy, but it lets you imagine the lives of all the people living in the 1,000 little boxes crammed together in the hole, or every freaky little carnival attraction at the Sorcerer's Blue Night Festival. And this is an area where the anime really lives up to the source material, even building on it in some cases. World designer Shinji Kimura has returned for the second season. He's been around for decades, even doing background art for movies like My Neighbor Totoro and Akira, which are probably two of the movies that would first come to my mind when I think about great background art, so you know you're in good hands. You can pause the show at basically any point and almost guarantee you're going to find the characters standing in front of some masterpiece worthy of being heisted from the Louvre. But its greatest strength lies in how it characterizes the locations and gives you instant context for the characters that live there. The Sorcerer's Dimension makes you feel like you're visiting some mashup of New Orleans and Paris, with its street-level carnival culture and string lights and its Baroque caricatures of opulent classical European architecture the closer you get to En's mansion in the center of the capital city. Everything in the Sorcerer's Dimension feels painterly and somehow magical, especially En's ever-present and at times nauseatingly detailed mushrooms, but even in the far-flung, impoverished rural parts of the dimension with its dilapidated wooden cottages and lush greenery. That's in sharp contrast to the dense, rusted, post-industrial look of the whole, where you can see the bones of what must have once been a thriving metropolis, but now most closely resembles the Kowloon walled city in the 80s, yet still harbors pockets of humanity and community, little places where people are getting by with what they have, and maybe a stray beam of sunshine even pokes through the blankets of smog every once in a while. This is fundamentally a story about class struggle, so the depictions of the built environment are crucial to that end, but also go a long way to ground the 3D characters within their world. Which brings me to the lighting and color design. It's an element that rarely stands out in anime, but in this one it's crucial to creating a cohesive world. It would be easy for the 2D art behind 3D characters to look like a school picture day backdrop, but because the characters are incorporated into these strong color palettes, they feel that much more like part of their world. The greenish fluorescent glow of Nikaido's gyoza shop and the hole in general, the orangish sulfury yellow when they go to a hot springs in the sorcerer's countryside that makes everyone's outlines turn into a reddish brown instead of the regular black, and N's mushrooms that always have this glowy teal aura around them. He's the most powerful guy around, so he can even dictate the color palette of an entire scene, like this one, where the shroomy haze fills the entire space, cut through only by the bright red sparks directly above his head that accentuate his hair and the caps of his mushrooms. This series may never achieve a widespread status beyond that of a cult classic, but my vendetta against people for dismissing it continues because it's a masterclass in putting energy and resources into the most important, if sometimes overlooked, details and playing to your strengths. I love it so much, and if you don't like the 3D animation, just read the manga. It's really gross, nasty, and yucky, but it's very fun and good, I promise. Okay, that's the end. I will be catching up on Witch Hat and most likely talking about that sometime soon. Sorry, I got depressed, but keep an eye out for that. Subscribe if you haven't, yada yada. Thanks to my loyal supporters on Patreon who I think about every night before going to sleep and every morning after waking up, but not in a weird way. Smackintosh, Scorpiante, Dodo and Gogo, KDL, Serialio, Leia Pico, Newtaf, Patrick Davison, Arborix, Junjun, Dr. Yellow McSwag, Grav G, Joe, Annie, Sammy C, Nozomi Corgi, Machu Stepek, Juicebox, Bloodsbane, Orwing, Chris Ushi, Triac, Alex Alotl, and Densha, as well as all the other names you're seeing on the screen right now. See you next time.